Welcome again to section 6 of the Complete iOS Developer course. In this section, we'll be downloading images from the web, learning how to use APIs and process JSON data, and building by far the most complex app that we've built as yet, a blog reader app. To start things off though, we're going to look at the built-in database storage that comes with iOS apps. This is known as core data, and it's one of those topics that's generally considered to be extremely confusing, but it's actually not too bad once you get to grips with it. It allows for, as I say, permanent data storage, but far more than you can have with user defaults. You already started to see the difficulties of using user defaults for anything beyond minimal data storage when we built the memorable Places app, and user defaults is definitely no good at all if you want to store large amounts of data, or if you want to make your data searchable or store it in a database-like format. So if you want to do that, and you probably do at some point, then you're going to want to click this button, Use Core Data. So this will be a core data demo, and just make sure you've clicked the core data button, and that will then set up all of the core data tools that you'll need within your app. So have a look around the screen and see if you can see anything new. Hopefully you'll spot this file on the left there, which is our data model. So our data model is much like a database structure, or if you like, an Excel spreadsheet. We start off with an entity, which is like a page on a spreadsheet or a table in a database. So I'm going to rename my entity to users, and this entity is going to have 3 attributes. We'll have a username, which is a string. You can see we've got all the standard data types there. We'll have a password, which is also a string, and we'll have an age, just for a bit of variety, which is going to be a 16-bit integer. And that's all we need for now. So those are our different columns of our spreadsheet, if you like, and we can store as many usernames, passwords, and ages as we like in our core data database. The data model is not the only thing that was added to our app when we ticked the core data box though. If we hop over to appdelegate.swift, now this is a file that we haven't looked at before, but essentially it's a collection of methods that control the basic functions of our apps. So things like did finish launching with options, application did enter background, application will enter foreground, etc. So it controls the big events when our app is loaded and removed from memory. And you can see here we've got some new methods inside the app delegate which allow us to work with core data. So we're going to be referring back to the app delegate very shortly. Alright, so that's enough of an introduction. Let's write some code to save and restore some data from the core data database there. So first off, let's import the core data framework so that we can use all the core data methods. And then we're going to set up 2 variables that may seem a little bit mysterious, and they are a little bit mysterious, but they'll help us access the data that we're going to store in core data. So the first one is going to be a variable called appDelegate, which is indeed referring to the appdelegate.swift file up there. And then we're going to take the UI application, so our whole app, look in the shared area and find the delegate. And we're going to force cast that to an app delegate that we know is going to work because it is an app delegate. So the app delegate here essentially refers to the appdelegate.swift file and those key methods which control the major functions within our app. Next, we create our second slightly mysterious variable, and that one we're going to call context. and we create it from the app delegate variable that we just created. And then within that, we select the persistent container, i.e. the container for persistent storage or the core data. And within that, we select the view context. So the best way to think of the context is much like the manager variables that we've created in recent projects, such as the location manager that enabled us to work with location, or the audio manager that allows us to work with audio. So essentially, we can use the context to access core data and save or restore data from the entity that we have created. So how do we do that? Well, before we restore any data, we're going to have to save some. So let's do that first. So we're going to save a new user. So let's create an object called new user, which will allow us to do this. And this is going to be an NS entity description dot insert new object. So this allows us to refer to a particular entity, which is of course going to be users, the entity that we created earlier on, to be our data model. And then we specify the context, which again is like our manager variable that allows us to access the persistent container or the core data database. And once we've done that, we can add some new users. So for example, we can say new user dot set value, and we might set Rob as the value for the key username. We then might want to set the value my pass for my password if I had very poor security. And while we're there, let's set the value 35 for the key age. And then what we need to do is save the context, and we need to do that under a do try catch construction. So let's set that up first. So we've got do and then catch. While we're there, we'll print there was an error. So this might happen, for example, if I try and save a user nam, that's not going to work because I haven't specified user nam in my data model. I have to get this right. So what we're going to try to do is save the context. So again, we use context and save. And we'll also print saved, just to verify that that's worked. Okay, so that's all there is to it. We've created an app delegate variable to refer to our app delegate. Then we've created a context variable to refer to the persistent container context. Then we've created a new user object, which allows us to insert a new object into our user's entity. We've then set various values for that new user, and we've saved the context within a do try catch construction. And there we go. You can see in the logs we've got saved there. So that looks promising. To be sure that it's worked though, we need to restore the data from core data. So let's do this now. We do it with what's known as a request. So let's take our request, and this is going to be an NS fetch request, and it's going to return an object of type NS fetch request result, which is similar to an array in many ways and allows us to get the data back from the database. And we're going to set this up with a particular entity name, which of course will be users. And there's one setting that we need to apply to our request, and it's a slightly odd one. It's request.returns objects as false, and we need to set that equal to false. And what that means is, by default, when the request is run, the device will return, instead of the actual values within the database, it will return false. Now this is useful for testing the structure of your core data and seeing what results there are, but it's not particularly useful for actually getting the results themselves. And that's what we want to do here, and to be honest, what you'll want to do most of the time. So probably when you're using requests on core data, you'll usually need to set returns objects as false. Otherwise, you'll find you won't get the actual values of the data. All right, so now let's run our request. We do this using do and catch. If there's a problem here, we'll say couldn't fetch results if something goes horribly wrong. And what we want to do is set a variable, let's say results equal to, and here's where we're going to do our try. And the command we're going to try is context.fetch and then the request, which is that. So that will do the request for us. And notice that we haven't put any customization into the request object at all. So all it's going to do is try and fetch everything within the entity users. We'll see in the next video how to do more advanced requests and only search, for example, for specific users. So now let's test to see if we actually got any results, because of course our core data might be blank. So we'll look for results.count. We'll check to see if that's greater than 0. If it's not, we'll print no results. And if it is, we want to loop through those results. So let's use a for loop. We'll look for result in results. And in order to access the results, we need to cast that to an NS managed object, or specifically an array of NS managed objects. Now this results is going to have a type of NS fetch request result, which is always castable to an array of NS managed objects. So we can quite safely use our exclamation mark there to force that to happen. And then we're going to try and get the username of the user that's been found in the entity. And we'll do that by checking to see if we can set up a variable called username, which is going to equal result dot value for key. And the key, of course, is username. And we're going to attempt to cast that to a string. So at the moment it will be an NS managed object. We want to test to see if we can cast it as a string, which we're pretty confident we can because we set it to be a string over here. But we should always check if there's any possibility of doubt, and if it's worked, then we'll just print it to the console. And just before I run that, I will set up another user just so that we can have a couple of users to be working with. So we should get the result just so we should get two results. Remember, we've set up a request on the entity name users. We've set returns objects as false as being false because we want to get the actual value of these objects. And then within a do try catch construction, we've created a results variable equal to the fetch request, or the results of the fetch request, tested to see if there are actually any values in that. And then If there are, we loop through those values as NS managed objects, and then we test to see if we can extract a username from them, and if we can, we print that username. And here we go. You can see that that's worked really well. We've got Rob and Kirsten, and of course we've still got our saved from where Kirsten was saved earlier on. So notice the critical thing there is that it's returned Rob. That's important because we've shut down and reloaded the app since we started it, so that means that it's storing our data within Core Data permanently. Excellent. So now time for you to try this out. One area where Core Data is most commonly used is of course when users log in to an app. So the challenge I'm going to give you is a reasonably simple one. I want you to create a new app which is a pretty minimal login app. So what this app will do is test initially to see if the user is logged in, by which we mean a username for them is saved in the Core Data. So you're going to do a request much like this one. And if it is, display a message to the user to say hello to, and then whatever their name is. If they're not logged in, I want the app to display a text field and a button to allow the user to enter their username. And then when they've done that and they press the button, it says the message once again. So a very simple login app, but it should give you a bit of practice of using the Core Data commands and integrating them with a user interface, which of course we haven't done yet. Best of luck. Go for it. All right, hope you managed that. I'm going to start by creating a new project. And then we'll stick, of course, to the single view application. I'm going to keep this very simple. And we'll call it a login demo. Make sure use core data is selected. And we'll save it on the desktop with all my other apps. And first off, I'll create the data model. So this is going to be even simpler than the model we had before. I'll call it users again. And then it's just going to have a single attribute name, which will be a string. Okay. Then we'll jump to main storyboard. And we're going to set up a text field, which will display if the user is not logged in. And we'll have a label to show we can say hello to the user if they are logged in. So I'll just add a quick placeholder. What is your name? And by default, we'll hide the label. So I'll do that by setting the label alpha to be 0, like that. We'll actually need to make it wider so that we can put the whole name in there. Okay. So before we write our core data code, let's just set up a couple of outlets. So we'll have a text field. We'll have our label. And actually, of course, we'll also need a button. So we'll move that over there to the right. And we'll call it login. No particular reason it's on the right. Just want to keep the UI as simple as possible. And then let's create an action there as well. Great. So the first thing we need to do is access core data and find out whether or not something has already been saved. So let's do that. Here we go. So over in view did load, we'll set up as before our app delegate, which is going to be UI application dot shared dot delegate, and we're going to cast that to an app delegate. Then we'll create our context, which is going to be app delegate dot persistent container dot view context, just as before. Then we're going to create a request, which is going to be an NS fetch request, which we can't access because I haven't imported the core data framework up here. There we go. So if you find out that these aren't auto-predicting for you, then that's probably why. And we're expecting NS fetch request results in response, and our entity name is users, just as we entered over here. And then we want to get the username of the user that's been saved. So let's set returns objects as false to be false. Then we set up our do catch we'll just say request failed, and then we're going to attempt to get the results. So this is going to be a try, and we're going to try to fetch the results from our context, and the request that we want to fetch is of course request. Then we're going to loop through the results. So result in results as an array of NS managed objects. And then we're going to attempt to get the username. So if let username equals, and then we'll take our result. We'll get a value for a particular key. That key, of course, is name. It's the name that we set there. And we're going to attempt to cast that to a string. And if that works, then we want to save that in the app. So we want to set the text field alpha to 0 to hide that. We want to set the login button alpha to 0, and we want to set the label alpha to 1. And while we're there, we'll set the label text to be equal to hi there, and then the username, and I'll put a cheery exclamation mark on the end as well. There we go. So that should test to see if we have a username saved, and if we do, then display that to the user. If we don't, of course, then we need to wait until the user logs in and then save them. So in the login method, once again, we'll create the app delegate. So UI application dot shared dot delegate as an app delegate. Then we'll create the context. So just as before, app delegate dot persistent container.viewContext. And this time we want to save our object. So we're going to create a new value, which is, as before, an NS entity description dot insert new object. And the entity name is, of course, users, and the context is context. Then we just set our new value to have a particular value, and we want to set the text field to be the value. So text field dot text, and then the key we want to save that for is, of course, name. Okay, and then finally we want to save this new value in core data. So we do that with do and catch. So if something goes wrong, print failed to save. And the thing we're going to attempt is to save the context. And if we're successful, we want to do the same thing that we did down here. So actually, I'll just copy that all over. So we're going to hide the text field, hide the login button, show the label, and set the label text to what they've entered. There we go. Yep, and we do need to force unwrap the text field text there. We know that the text field is a text field, so it will definitely have a text value, even if that text value is empty. All right, so now when we run the app, it should search through core data to find a value. If it finds one, it will display hi there and then show the username that they've saved. And if it doesn't find one, it won't do that. So it will show the text field and the button. And when the button is tapped, it will hopefully save the button value in core data and display the label hi there and then the user's name. Note, we didn't need to unwrap here. We can reasonably use an optional for our set value, which means that this value itself might be an optional. But that's okay. That's why we do this test when we bring it back to see if we can get it and if we can cast it as a string. Okay, let's test this out. So here we go. Tap in the books to enter your name. And I'll just enter Rob there and then tap login. And there we go. So we've now lost the button and the text field, and it says, hi there, Rob. So that's all looking good. Let's now run the app again. And the crucial thing is, this time, will it display hi there, Rob, and hide the text field and the button? Fingers crossed. And there we go. That's worked exactly as we intended. All right, I hope you managed to do that, and I hope you now have a fairly good understanding of how core data works. Of course, our usage of core data in that app was pretty simplistic. In fact, we could have used permanent storage just as easily. So in the next video, we're going to see how core data is more powerful than permanent storage and how we can use it to do things like search the data that we've got to find particular results and update and even delete existing results. So we'll do that all in the next video. See you there.